David Chun had always been the kind of kid who preferred corners to center stage. While other 17-year-olds at Riverside High were posting videos on social media and fighting for attention, David found comfort in being invisible. His thick-rimmed glasses and slightly oversized sweaters made him blend into the background of hallways and classrooms. Exactly where he wanted to be, every day followed the same quiet routine. David would slip into school just before the first bell, navigate through crowds of chattering students without making eye contact, and claim his favorite spot in the back corner of each classroom. During lunch, while others gathered in loud groups around picnic tables, he would find a quiet bench near the library and eat his sandwich, while reading whatever book had caught his interest that week. But David had a secret that nobody at school knew about. Every afternoon, when the final bell released him from the social maze of high school, he would take the city bus to his grandmother's small house on Maple Street. There, in her dimly lit basement, sat an old upright piano that had been gathering dust for decades. His grandmother, Mrs. Chun, was a tiny woman with silver hair who spoke in a mixture of English and Mandarin. She had bought the piano years ago, with dreams of learning to play, but arthritis had made her fingers too stiff to manage the keys. When David first discovered the instrument 3 years ago, she had smiled and said, "Maybe the piano was waiting for you, not me." What started as curious finger tapping had slowly become David's greatest passion. With no formal lessons and no sheet music, he began teaching himself to play by listening to songs on his phone and trying to recreate the melodies. His grandmother would sit in her favorite armchair nearby, sipping tea and humming along as David's skills gradually improved. The basement became his sanctuary. Down there, surrounded by storage boxes and the gentle hum of the old furnace, David could let his guard down completely. His fingers would dance across the keys, creating melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his heart. Sometimes he would play for hours, losing track of time as music filled the small space. His grandmother never pushed him to perform or show off his growing talent. She seemed to understand that the piano was David's private escape, his way of expressing feelings he could never put into words. When he played sad songs, she would nod knowingly. When he discovered jazz and started experimenting with improvisation, her eyes would light up with pride. David's parents knew he spent time at his grandmother's house, but they assumed he was just helping with chores or keeping her company. They had no idea that their quiet, bookish son was developing into a remarkable musician. David preferred it that way. The music was his secret world, separate from the complications of school and social expectations. At Riverside High, David's teachers saw him as a reliable but unremarkable student. He turned in assignments on time, never caused trouble, and maintained decent grades without drawing attention to himself. His English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, sometimes noticed David's thoughtful essays, but David always deflected praise with nervous shrugs and quick changes of subject. The other students barely registered David's existence. He wasn't bullied or picked on, he was simply overlooked. In a school of nearly 2,000 students, it was easy to disappear into the crowd. David had learned to navigate the hallways like a ghost, timing his movements to avoid the busiest areas and loudest groups. But invisibility came with its own challenges. David often felt like he was watching life happen around him instead of participating in it. He would see classmates excitedly planning weekend activities or discussing upcoming school events, and he would wonder what it might feel like to be included in those conversations. Still, the idea of actually joining in felt terrifying and impossible. His lunch routine had become a careful science. David would arrive at the cafeteria early, grab his food quickly, and escape to his quiet corner before the popular crowds arrived. He had memorized which tables stayed empty and which routes through the school, allowed him to avoid the main gathering spots where students clustered between classes. Despite his social isolation, David was genuinely content with his afternoons at his grandmother's house. The piano had become more than just an instrument. It was his voice, his confidant, his best friend. When he played, all the awkwardness and uncertainty of his daily life melted away. He could express joy, sadness, frustration, and hope through music in ways he never could through words. His grandmother would often tell him stories about his grandfather, who had died before David was born. "Your grandfather had music in his soul too," she would say while listening to David play. "He used to hum melodies while he worked in his garden. I think you inherited his gift." These conversations made David feel connected to something larger than himself, even if he had no intention of sharing his music with anyone else. The spring of David's junior year arrived with the usual flurry of school activities and events. Posters appeared in hallways advertising the annual spring festival, a tradition that brought together students, parents, and community members for an evening of entertainment and celebration. David had attended the festival as a freshman, sitting in the back with his parents and watching classmates perform various talents on stage. Mrs. Patterson, the drama teacher who coordinated the festival, was known throughout the school for her energy and determination. She taught theater classes and directed the school plays, always encouraging students to step outside their comfort zones and discover hidden talents. This year, she was facing an unusual problem with the festival lineup. Several acts had dropped out at the last minute. The student band had broken up after a dramatic disagreement between band members. Two of the planned dance groups had conflicts with sports tournaments. Mrs. Patterson found herself desperately searching for additional performers to fill the evening's entertainment slots. In her small office backstage in the auditorium, Mrs. Patterson was going through old class rosters and activity lists, hoping to find students who might have forgotten talents or interests. She remembered that the school had offered a beginner piano class 2 years ago, though it had been discontinued due to budget cuts and low enrollment. Flipping through the old attendance records, she found a short list of students who had signed up for the piano class. Most of the names belonged to students who had since graduated or transferred. But one name caught her attention: David Chun, still a current junior. Mrs. Patterson barely knew David personally, but she vaguely remembered seeing his name on honor roll lists and in academic award announcements. She had probably passed him in hallways hundreds of times without really noticing him. But if he had taken a piano class, maybe he still played. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson decided to track down David between classes. She spotted him near his locker, quietly organizing books in his backpack. He looked exactly like the kind of studious, responsible student who might be willing to help with a school event. "David Chun?" she called out as she approached him. David looked up with surprise and mild panic. Teachers rarely singled him out in public spaces. He nodded nervously, pushing his glasses up his nose. Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "I'm Mrs. Patterson from the drama department. I was wondering if you might be interested in performing at our spring festival next month." David's face went pale. The idea of performing anything in front of people was his worst nightmare. I don't think I'm really performer material," he stammered. "I saw your name on an old piano class roster," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Do you still play? We're looking for some musical acts, and it would just be something light and fun. Nothing too serious or stressful." David's mind raced. How could he explain that while he did play piano, the thought of performing in front of an audience made him want to disappear entirely? How could he tell her that his music was private, personal, sacred? I do play a little," he admitted reluctantly. "But I've never performed for anyone before." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up with hope. "That's perfectly fine. The festival is about celebrating our school community, not about professional-level performances. We just need students willing to share their talents. Would you consider it? Maybe just one song, 5 minutes at most?" Standing in that hallway, surrounded by the usual chaos of students changing classes, David felt trapped between his terror of public performance and his reluctance to disappoint a teacher who was clearly counting on his help. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, always encouraging him to be brave and kind. I guess I could think about it," he heard himself saying, though every instinct screamed at him to run away. Mrs. Patterson beamed. "Wonderful. I'll put you down tentatively for a short piano piece. We can talk more about details later." "Thank you so much, David. You have no idea how much this helps." As she walked away, David stood frozen at his locker, wondering what he had just agreed to and whether he would have the courage to go through with it. The days following Mrs. Patterson's request felt like a strange dream to David. He went through his usual routine of classes, lunch alone and afternoon piano sessions at his grandmother's house, but everything felt different somehow. The weight of his promise to consider performing hung over him like a dark cloud dot at first. David tried to convince himself that Mrs. Patterson would forget about their conversation. Maybe she would find other performers and wouldn't need him after all. But those hopes were crushed when she approached him again 3 days later with a clipboard and an enthusiastic smile. "David, I'm so glad I found you," she said, catching him as he headed toward the library during lunch. "I wanted to follow up about the spring festival. Have you had a chance to think about what piece you might like to perform?" David's stomach dropped. The casual way she asked made it clear that she had already counted him as a confirmed performer. There was no easy way to back out now without seeming unreliable or disappointing her completely. I haven't really decided yet," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Patterson nodded encouragingly. "That's totally fine. You have plenty of time to choose something. The festival is still 3 weeks away. Just pick something you enjoy playing and feel comfortable with. Remember, this is supposed to be fun, not stressful." Fun. The word seemed impossible to David. How could performing in front of hundreds of people possibly be fun? But he nodded anyway, trapped by his own politeness and inability to disappoint others. "I'll put you down for a 5-minute slot in the first half of the program," Mrs. Patterson continued, making notes on her clipboard. "Does that work for you?" Sure, David replied, though his heart was racing at the thought of it actually being scheduled and official. After Mrs. Patterson walked away, David stood in the hallway feeling like he might be sick. 5 minutes, in front of the entire school community. The very thought made his palms sweat and his breathing shallow. That afternoon at his grandmother's house, David sat at the piano bench but couldn't bring himself to play. His fingers hovered over the keys while his mind raced with worry and regret. "What's wrong today?" his grandmother asked, settling into her usual chair with her afternoon tea. "You look like someone stole your favorite book." David had never told his grandmother about his school life or how invisible he felt among his classmates. She knew he was quiet and studious, but she didn't know about the daily struggle of navigating social situations or his deep fear of being the center of attention. "Grandma," he said slowly, "what would you do if someone asked you to do something that terrified you, but you already said you would consider it?" His grandmother set down her teacup and studied his face with the wisdom that came from decades of life experience. "Is this about sharing your music?" she asked gently. David's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" She smiled. "You play with such beautiful emotion, dear one. Music like yours isn't meant to be hidden forever. Someone was bound to notice eventually." "But I can't perform in front of people," David said, his voice cracking slightly. "I can barely talk to people, let alone play piano for them. What if I mess up? What if they laugh? What if I freeze up completely?" His grandmother was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea and watching him with kind eyes. "Your grandfather used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing something important even when you are afraid." "But this isn't important," David protested. "It's just a school festival. It doesn't matter." "If it doesn't matter, why are you so worried about it?" she asked with a gentle smile. David didn't have an answer for that. He sat at the piano, staring at the keys that had become such a source of comfort and expression for him. The thought of playing these same keys while hundreds of eyes watched him felt impossible. Over the next few days, David found himself caught in an endless cycle of anxiety and second-guessing. During classes, he would imagine all the ways the performance could go wrong. He pictured himself forgetting how to play entirely, his hands shaking so badly that he couldn't hit the right keys. Or worse, playing beautifully only to have the audience sit in bored silence. His usual invisibility at school now felt like a cruel joke. Soon, everyone would know exactly who David Chun was because he would be the kid who either embarrassed himself at the piano or surprised everyone with hidden talent. Neither option felt comfortable. Mrs. Patterson seemed to appear everywhere. David went She would wave cheerfully across the cafeteria or give him encouraging thumbs up in the hallways. Each friendly gesture made David feel more trapped in his commitment. One particularly difficult day, David seriously considered telling Mrs. Patterson that he had changed his mind. He practiced the conversation in his head during lunch, imagining how he would explain that he wasn't ready for public performance. But every time he saw her, she looked so grateful and relieved to have found another act for the festival that he couldn't bring himself to disappoint her. The spring festival was apparently a bigger deal than David had realized. Posters appeared throughout the school featuring colorful graphics and exciting promises of entertainment. Students began talking about it in classes and hallways. Some were planning to attend with friends or family members. Others were excited about performing their own acts. David overheard conversations about previous year's festivals and how memorable some of the performances had been. A girl in his chemistry class mentioned that her older brother had performed a magic act 3 years ago and still got recognized for it around town. The thought of being remembered for his performance, good or bad, made David feel even more anxious. At home, David's parents noticed that he seemed more distracted than usual. His mother asked if everything was okay at school, and David considered telling them about the festival. But explaining the situation would mean admitting that he had been secretly learning piano for years, and he wasn't ready for that conversation either. His grandmother continued to be his only confidant, though she didn't push him to make any particular decision. She simply listened when he expressed his fears and continued to encourage him to trust in his abilities. "The music you play here moves my heart every time," she told him one afternoon. "If it can touch an old woman like me, imagine what it might do for people who have never heard you play." "But what if they don't like it?" David asked. "What if classical music and jazz aren't what they want to hear?" "Then they will have learned something new," his grandmother replied. "Not everyone has to love everything, but everyone deserves the chance to experience beauty." As the festival date grew closer, Mrs. Patterson began asking David about practical details. What song would he play? Did he need sheet music provided? Would he need any special equipment or setup? Each question forced David to confront the reality that this performance was actually going to happen. He couldn't keep putting off the decisions forever. Reluctantly, he began thinking seriously about what he might play. His first instinct was to choose something simple and safe, a basic classical piece that wouldn't challenge him technically or emotionally. But when he sat at his grandmother's piano and tried to play these safer options, they felt hollow and meaningless. They didn't represent who he really was as a musician. The pieces that felt most natural to him were the ones he had developed through years of experimentation and emotional expression. These were the songs that flowed from his heart rather than from sheet music, the melodies that captured his feelings and experiences in ways that words never could. But playing those personal pieces in public felt like exposing his soul to strangers. It would be like reading his diary aloud or sharing his most private thoughts with people who barely knew his name. 2 weeks before the festival, Mrs. Patterson cornered David again with her clipboard and her determined smile. "We're finalizing the program order," she said. "I need to know what piece you'll be performing so I can introduce you properly." David's mouth went dry. This was it. No more delaying or avoiding the decision. "I'm not sure about the title," he said honestly. "It's something I've been working on myself." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows raised with interest and approval. "An original composition? That's wonderful." "Even better. What should I call it in the program?" David's mind went completely blank. He had never given names to any of his musical creations. They were just feelings and emotions translated into melodies. Maybe just call it piano solo?" he suggested. "Weekly, perfect," Mrs. Patterson said, writing it down. "This is going to be great, David. I can tell you're nervous, but trust me, once you're up there playing, the nerves will disappear. Music has a way of taking over." As she walked away, David wondered if Mrs. Patterson was right. Would the music really take over, or would his fear overwhelm everything else? In just 2 weeks he would find out. The 2 weeks leading up to the Spring Festival became the longest 14 days of David's life. Every morning he would wake up with a knot in his stomach. remembering that he was one day closer to sitting exposed at a piano in front of hundreds of people. The countdown felt like waiting for his own execution. At school, David's carefully constructed invisibility began to feel more fragile than ever. He found himself looking at his classmates differently, wondering which ones would be in the audience watching him perform. The cheerful girl who sat 2 seats ahead of him in history class, the group of athletes who always dominated the lunch tables, the theater kids who seemed so confident and outgoing, they would all be there, potentially judging his performance. The worst part was that David couldn't even explain to anyone why this felt so terrifying. To most people, playing piano at a school event would seem like a minor challenge, maybe even an honor. But for someone who had spent 3 years of high school perfecting the art of being unnoticed, stepping into the spotlight felt like jumping off a cliff. Sleep became nearly impossible. David would lie in bed at night, his mind racing through every possible disaster scenario. What if his hands shook so badly that he couldn't play at all? What if he forgot the melody halfway through? What if the audience started talking or laughing during his performance? What if he played beautifully and everyone expected him to become the school's official piano player for every future event? During his afternoon sessions at his grandmother's house, David's playing became tense and uncertain. The music that had always flowed naturally from his fingers now felt forced and awkward. He would start a piece, make a small mistake, and then stop in frustration. "You're thinking too much," his grandmother observed one afternoon, watching him struggle through a melody he had played perfectly dozens of times before. "The music knows the way. You just have to trust it." "But what if I can't trust it when people are watching?" David asked, his voice filled with desperation. "What if being nervous makes me forget everything I know?" His grandmother set down her knitting and looked at him with the patient wisdom she had shown throughout his entire life. "Do you remember when you first started playing? You didn't know any songs, but you would sit here and let your fingers find their own way across the keys." David nodded, remembering those early days when he had no expectations or pressure, just curiosity and joy in creating sounds. "That's still inside you," she continued. "The fear is new, but the music is the same. The music doesn't care if people are watching." Despite his grandmother's encouragement, David's anxiety continued to grow. He began avoiding Mrs. Patterson in the hallways, taking longer routes to classes to reduce the chance of running into her and her enthusiastic updates about the festival. When he did see her, she would wave cheerfully and call out things like, "Getting excited for your big debut," which only made his stomach churn more violently. The festival posters seemed to multiply throughout the school. They appeared on classroom doors, bulletin boards, and even in bathroom stalls. Each poster reminded David that the event was approaching whether he felt ready or not. He began to understand why some students dropped out of performances at the last minute. The pressure became overwhelming. One particularly bad day, David seriously considered faking illness to avoid the performance entirely. He researched symptoms that might require him to stay home for several days, wondering if his parents would believe he had suddenly developed a stomach bug or severe headache. But the thought of disappointing Mrs. Patterson and leaving her scrambling to fill his spot made him feel even worse than the performance anxiety. His regular classes became harder to focus on. Teachers would be explaining important concepts, and David would find his mind wandering to the festival. He imagined walking onto the stage, sitting at the piano bench, and facing an audience of people he barely knew. The image was so vivid and terrifying that it sometimes made him feel dizzy during lunch. David's usual corner table felt even more isolated than before. He would watch other students chatting and laughing together, and wonder what it would be like to have friends who could offer support and encouragement. Instead, he faced this challenge completely alone. Except for his grandmother's gentle wisdom, the irony wasn't lost on David that his love of music, which had been his greatest source of comfort, was now causing him tremendous stress. The piano that had been his refuge was about to become the instrument of his public exposure. Sometimes he wondered if he should have just stayed invisible forever. Mrs. Patterson seemed oblivious to David's growing distress. She would mention the festival with such genuine excitement that David couldn't bring himself to reveal how much he was struggling. She clearly saw this as a wonderful opportunity for him to share his talent, while he saw it as a form of torture. Really looking forward to hearing what you've prepared, she told him one morning. Original compositions are always so special. They give us a glimpse into the artist's soul. The phrase, glimpse into the artist's soul, made David want to run away immediately. His music was deeply personal, filled with emotions and experiences he had never shared with anyone except his grandmother. The thought of strangers analyzing and judging those private feelings felt like emotional NAKEDNESS. As the festival date approached, David's parents began to notice his unusual behavior. His mother commented that he seemed more distracted than usual, and his father asked if everything was okay at school. David considered telling them about the performance, but explaining the situation would require revealing his secret musical life, and he wasn't ready for that conversation. The fact that his own parents didn't know about his piano playing added another layer of stress. If he went through with the performance, they would likely hear about it from other parents or see it mentioned in the school newsletter. He would have to explain why he had kept this important part of his life hidden from them. David began having stress dreams about the festival. In one recurring nightmare, he would sit at the piano and discover that all the keys had been removed. In another, he would start playing beautifully, but no sound would come out of the instrument. The worst dream involved him playing perfectly. While the entire audience slowly got up and walked out in boredom, his grandmother noticed the dark circles under his eyes and his decreased appetite. "You're making yourself sick with worry," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to tell that teacher you've changed your mind." The suggestion should have brought relief, but instead it made David feel like a coward. Part of him desperately wanted to back out, but another part felt like giving up would prove that he was as weak and invisible as he had always believed himself to be. What if this is my only chance to be brave? David asked his grandmother one afternoon, "What if I spend the rest of my life regretting that I didn't try?" His grandmother smiled sadly. "And what if you spend the rest of your life regretting that you tortured yourself for something that wasn't worth the pain?" It was a question David couldn't answer. He felt trapped between his fear of performing and his fear of being a quitter. Neither choice felt right, but time was running out for making any choice at all. 3 days before the festival, Mrs. Patterson handed David a printed program. His name appeared in black text, David Chun, piano solo. Seeing it in print made everything feel terrifyingly real and final. "This is it," he thought to himself, staring at his name on the page. "There's no going back now." But even as he accepted the inevitable, David wondered if he was walking toward the biggest mistake of his life or the moment that would change everything. The only certainty was that in 3 days, his carefully protected secret would be exposed to the world, and nothing would ever be the same again. That night, David sat at his grandmother's piano and played with a mixture of desperation and resignation. These might be his last peaceful moments with the music before it became something public and complicated. He wanted to remember how it felt when the piano was still his alone. The morning of the spring festival arrived with an unseasonably gray sky that matched David's mood perfectly. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning while his mind replayed every possible way the evening could go wrong. When his alarm clock finally rang at 7 in the morning, he felt like he had been awake for days. David's usual morning routine felt surreal and disconnected from reality. He brushed his teeth while staring at his pale reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if this was the last morning he would wake up as an invisible student. By tomorrow, everyone at school would know who David Chun was. For better or worse. At breakfast, his parents chatted about their weekend plans while David pushed scrambled eggs around his plate without really eating them. His stomach felt too twisted with nerves to handle food. His mother noticed his lack of appetite and asked if he was feeling sick, which wasn't entirely wrong. David managed a weak smile and claimed he was just tired. The school day passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. David sat through his morning classes without absorbing any of the information being taught. Teachers' voices seemed to come from far away, and he found himself staring out windows or at the clock, counting down the hours until the festival began. At 7 o'clock that evening during lunch, David couldn't even pretend to eat. He sat at his usual corner table, watching his classmates go about their normal Friday routines while he felt like he was preparing for battle. Some students were excitedly discussing their plans to attend the festival that evening. Others were talking about weekend parties and movie plans. David envied their carefree attitudes and normal teenage concerns. Mrs. Patterson found him during lunch period, practically glowing with excitement about the evening ahead. "Tonight's the big night," she said cheerfully, sitting down across from him uninvited. "Are you feeling ready?" David managed a weak nod, not trusting his voice to sound normal. The truth was that he felt about as far from ready as humanly possible, but admitting that now would only create panic for Mrs. Patterson and probably wouldn't change anything anyway. "I wanted to let you know that we've got a really nice crowd." "Expected," she continued, apparently oblivious to David's growing distress. "The mayor is planning to attend, and several school board members. Plus, of course, lots of families and students. It should be a wonderful evening." The news that local officials would be in the audience made David's already churning stomach feel even worse. He had been nervous about performing for his classmates and their families, but the idea of playing for people in positions of authority added a whole new level of pressure. "The piano is already set up on stage," Mrs. Patterson added. "I had our maintenance team tune it yesterday, so it should sound beautiful. You're scheduled fourth in the lineup, so you'll have a chance to settle in and watch a few other acts before your turn." David nodded again, though the information felt like it was being delivered to someone else. Fourth in the lineup meant he would have to sit backstage, watching other performers and building up anxiety for what felt like an eternity. Before his turn came, the afternoon classes were even worse than the morning ones. David's hands had developed a slight tremor that made taking notes nearly impossible. He kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes tick by toward his appointment with terror. By the time the final bell rang at 3:15, David felt like he might actually be sick. Instead of going to his grandmother's house as usual, David went straight home. He needed to be alone with his thoughts and try to prepare mentally for what lay ahead. His parents were both at work, so the house was quiet and empty, which felt appropriate for what might be his last afternoon of anonymity. David tried to practice on the old keyboard in his bedroom, but his hands were shaking too badly to play anything recognizable. The music that had always been his source of comfort now felt foreign and unreachable. He wondered if this was what athletes felt like before important competitions, or if actors experienced similar terror before opening nights. Around 5 o'clock, David's parents returned home from work, both excited about attending the festival. They had received a notice from the school about the evening's entertainment, and were looking forward to seeing what their fellow community members had prepared. "Should be fun to see what kind of talent our school has," his father said over an early dinner that David couldn't bring himself to eat. "I remember when I was in high school, we had a kid who could do amazing magic tricks. Wonder what kind of acts they'll have tonight." David's mother nodded enthusiastically. "Mrs. Johnson from down the street mentioned that her daughter is performing a dance routine. I love seeing young people express themselves creatively." Their casual conversation about the festival made David realize how completely normal and enjoyable this evening would be for everyone except him. While hundreds of people gathered to have fun and celebrate their community, he would be fighting a private battle with his own fear and anxiety. At 6:30, David's family climbed into their car to head to the school. The drive felt both too long and too short. David wanted to delay his arrival, but also wanted to get the waiting over with. His parents chatted about their day while David stared out the window, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by and wondering if he would feel different about these same streets. Tomorrow. The school parking lot was already filling up with cars. When they arrived, families were walking toward the main entrance, many carrying flowers or small gifts for performers. Children were running ahead of their parents, excited about the evening's entertainment. The whole scene had a festive, celebratory atmosphere that made David feel even more isolated in his private terror. "We'll find good seats and cheer you on from the audience," his mother said as they approached the school entrance, though of course she had no idea that David would be anywhere except sitting beside them. David mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom and separated from his parents in the crowded lobby. His real destination was the backstage area where Mrs. Patterson had told performers to gather by 7 o'clock. The walk down the familiar hallway toward the auditorium felt like a march toward his own doom. The backstage area was buzzing with nervous energy and excited chatter. David recognized some of the other performers from school, though he had never spoken to most of them. There was Jennifer from his English class, dressed in a colorful dance costume. Two seniors with guitars were tuning their instruments and running through lyrics under their breath. A group of younger students, wearing matching t-shirts, were practicing some kind of group performance. Everyone else seemed nervous but excited. The kind of pre-performance jitters that came with anticipation and eagerness to share their talents. David felt like he was the only person present who was genuinely terrified and questioning his life choices. Mrs. Patterson appeared with her clipboard and her seemingly endless enthusiasm. "Everyone gather around," she called out cheerfully. "I want to go over the running order one more time and make sure everyone knows when they're up." She read through the list of performers while David's heart pounded harder with each name. First up was the school's jazz ensemble, then Jennifer's dance routine, then a comedy duo from the drama club, and then David Chun with his original piano composition. Hearing his name announced to the group of performers made everything feel terrifyingly real. Several other students looked around curiously, probably wondering who David was since he had never been involved in school performances before. He managed a weak wave when Mrs. Patterson pointed him out. "David's been working on something very special," Mrs. Patterson announced proudly. "An original piece that I'm sure will be beautiful." The weight of expectation in her voice made David want to disappear completely. She clearly believed he was going to deliver something wonderful, and he had no idea if he could live up to that confidence or if he would simply freeze up completely when the moment came. Through the backstage curtains, David could hear the auditorium filling with people. Voices and laughter echoed from the growing crowd, punctuated by the occasional screech of microphone feedback as the sound system was tested. Each sound reminded him that in less than an hour, all those people would be watching him. The first performers were called to their positions, and David watched them walk confidently toward the stage entrance. He envied their apparent calm and wished he could borrow even a fraction of their self-assurance. Instead, he found a quiet corner backstage and tried to remember his grandmother's advice about trusting the music to know its own way. But as the minutes ticked by and his turn approached, David wondered if the music would abandon him entirely when he needed it most. The first 3 acts of the Spring Festival passed in a blur for David. He stood in the wings, watching the jazz ensemble fill the auditorium with upbeat melodies that had the audience clapping along. Their confidence and energy seemed to flow effortlessly from the stage, and David wondered how they made performing look so natural and enjoyable. Jennifer's dance routine was next, a beautiful contemporary piece that told a story through graceful movements. The audience was completely captivated, and when she finished, the applause was long and enthusiastic. David watched her take her bow with a radiant smile, clearly thriving under the spotlight that terrified him so much. The comedy duo from Drama Club had everyone laughing with their witty skits and perfect timing. Even from backstage, David could hear the audience's delighted responses. Their performance was polished and professional, the result of weeks of rehearsal and natural stage presence that David envied desperately. As each act concluded successfully, David felt the weight of expectation growing heavier on his shoulders. The audience was clearly enjoying themselves and had been treated to genuinely entertaining performances. How could he possibly follow acts that were so well prepared and confident? "David, you're up next," Mrs. Patterson whispered, appearing at his elbow with an encouraging smile. "How are you feeling?" David's mouth had gone completely dry. I'm not sure I can do this," he managed to whisper back. his voice barely audible over the audience's applause for the comedy duo. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to one of gentle concern. Of course you can. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have something special to share. Just remember, everyone out there wants you to succeed. They're not here to judge you harshly. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they only reminded David that hundreds of people were indeed sitting out there, waiting to hear what he could do. The thought made his hands start trembling again, and he wondered if he would even be able to press the piano keys properly. The comedy duo finished their final skit to thunderous applause and bounded off the stage, high-fiving each other and clearly energized by their successful performance. Their joy and satisfaction made David feel even more isolated in his terror. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcer's voice over the sound system, "our next performer is David Chun, a junior, here at Riverside High, who will be sharing an original piano composition with us this evening." David's legs felt like they might give out completely. Original composition? The words seemed to echo endlessly in his mind. He had never actually given his musical creations formal titles or structure. They were just emotions that flowed through his fingers when he sat at his grandmother's piano. How could he perform something so personal and undefined for strangers? Mrs. Patterson gave him a gentle push toward the stage entrance. "Go on," she whispered. "You've got this." David walked toward the stage on unsteady legs, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the entire audience could hear it. The bright stage lights temporarily blinded him, and for a moment he couldn't see anything beyond the glowing footlights. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he caught glimpses of the packed auditorium stretching out before him. The piano sat center stage. A beautiful black grand piano that looked far more elegant and intimidating than his grandmother's humble upright. David had never played on an instrument of this quality before, and he wondered if it would respond differently to his touch. As he made his way across the stage, David became acutely aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the auditorium. Hundreds of people were watching his every move, waiting to see what this quiet boy they had never noticed could possibly do at a piano. The weight of their attention felt crushing. David reached the piano bench and paused, looking out at the sea of faces for the first time. He could see his parents in the fourth row, their expressions surprised and confused. They had no idea their son could play piano, let alone well enough to perform at a school event. Their shock was visible even from the stage. Other familiar faces dotted the audience. Classmates from his various classes, teachers he recognized, neighbors from his street. All of them were watching him with curious expressions, probably wondering what the quiet kid from the back of the classroom was doing on stage. David sat down at the piano bench, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together for a moment to try to steady them. He looked down at the pristine black and white keys, so different from the yellowed, worn keys of his grandmother's piano. These keys looked like they belonged to a real musician, not someone who had taught himself to play in a basement. The silence in the auditorium stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. David knew he needed to start playing, but his mind had gone completely blank. He couldn't remember a single melody that had ever flowed from his fingers. All those hours of beautiful music seemed to have vanished completely, leaving him sitting, frozen at an expensive piano in front of hundreds of expectant people. He could hear small sounds from the audience now, someone coughing, programs rustling, a child whispering to their parent. The normal sounds of a crowd waiting for something to happen. David realized he had been sitting in silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Panic began to set in. What if he really couldn't remember how to play? What if 3 years of musical development had just disappeared under pressure? David closed his eyes and tried to find some connection to the music that had been such an important part of his life. Then, almost without conscious thought, his hands moved to the keys. Instead of trying to remember a specific piece he had practiced, he simply let his fingers find their way to a chord, then another. The sound that came from the grand piano was richer and more beautiful than anything he had ever heard from his grandmother's instrument. The first few notes were tentative and uncertain, but they were notes nonetheless. David felt a tiny spark of relief that he could still make music, even if his heart was racing and his breathing was shallow with fear. But then something unexpected began to happen. As his fingers continued moving across the keys, finding familiar patterns and progressions, David felt a shift somewhere deep inside himself. The music wasn't the safe, simple piece he had planned to play. Instead, it was something that seemed to come from a place he had never accessed before. The melody that emerged was haunting and beautiful, starting soft and hesitant but gradually growing stronger. David found himself playing not with his mind, which was still paralyzed with fear, but with something deeper and more instinctive. His hands seemed to know exactly where to go, even though he wasn't consciously directing them. As the music continued to flow, David became dimly aware that the atmosphere in the auditorium was changing. The restless energy and casual chatter that had characterized the audience during previous acts was giving way to something different. People were becoming very still, very quiet, very focused on what they were hearing. The melody David was playing seemed to capture emotions he had never been able to express in words. All the loneliness of his high school years, all the beauty he had found in his grandmother's basement, all the fear and hope and confusion of being 17 years old, it was all there in the music, flowing out of him and into the vast space of the auditorium. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. The music knows the way. You just have to trust it. For the first time in weeks, David began to understand what she meant. The music didn't care that hundreds of people were watching. It didn't care that he was terrified or unprepared. The music simply was, and it wanted to be shared. As this realization dawned on him, David felt his fear beginning to transform into something else entirely. He was still nervous, still acutely aware of the audience, but underneath that surface anxiety, something profound was happening. He was finally allowing his true musical self to emerge from the hiding place where it had lived for 3 years. The piano seemed to respond to this internal shift, producing tones that were even richer and more expressive. David's playing grew more confident, though he still had no idea where the music was leading him. He was simply following the melody wherever it wanted to go, trusting in the process that had brought him so much joy in private. For the first time since Mrs. Patterson had approached him in the hallway weeks ago, David stopped thinking about the performance as something to endure and started experiencing it as something to embrace. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and it was only the beginning of what would prove to be the most important night of his life. As David's initial melody continued to flow from the grand piano, something magical began happening in the auditorium. The casual chattering and program rustling that had accompanied the earlier acts gradually faded into complete silence. It wasn't the polite quiet of an audience trying to be respectful. It was the profound stillness that comes when people encounter something truly unexpected and beautiful. David was only dimly aware of this change at first. His focus had turned inward, following the music wherever it wanted to lead him. The simple melody he had started with was evolving, growing more complex and emotionally rich with each passing moment. His hands seemed to move independently of his conscious mind, finding chord progressions and musical phrases he didn't even know he understood. The haunting melody began to weave together with classical influences David had absorbed during his years of self-teaching. Without planning it, he found his left hand picking up a bass line reminiscent of Bach, while his right hand continued the original emotional theme. The two musical ideas danced together, creating harmonies that surprised even David himself. In the audience, people were experiencing something they hadn't expected from a simple school talent show. Mrs. Patterson stood frozen in the wings, her mouth slightly open as she realized the quiet student she had casually recruited was producing music of extraordinary depth and beauty. She had hoped for a pleasant piano piece that would fill 5 minutes of the program. What she was hearing was something that belonged in a concert hall. David's parents sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were witnessing. Their son, who they thought they knew completely, was revealing a hidden world of talent and emotion that had been developing right under their noses. His father leaned forward in his seat, completely captivated by the music flowing from the stage. His mother had tears forming in her eyes, moved by both the beauty of the performance and the realization of how much of David's inner life had remained private. The classical foundation David had unconsciously established began to shift and evolve. Jazz influences started creeping into the music, subtle at first, then more pronounced. He had spent countless hours listening to old jazz recordings at his grandmother's house, and now those rhythms and chord structures emerged naturally from his fingers. The combination of classical technique with jazz improvisation created something uniquely his own. Students who had never paid attention to David before found themselves completely absorbed in his performance. Jennifer, who had just finished her dance routine, stood backstage watching in amazement. The comedy duo, still buzzing from their successful act, had gone quiet as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the younger students stopped their nervous chatter to listen. David's music continued to evolve and surprise everyone, including himself. The jazz influences gave way to something even more personal and original. He began incorporating melodies that came from his own emotional experiences, the loneliness of eating lunch alone, the joy he felt when discovering a new musical idea, the comfort he found in his grandmother's unconditional support. The grand piano responded to his touch, with rich, complex tones that seemed to fill every corner of the large auditorium. David had never played an instrument of this quality before, and he found that it could express subtle emotional nuances that his grandmother's old upright simply couldn't capture. Every gentle touch produced beautiful sounds, while stronger strikes created powerful, resonant notes that seemed to vibrate through the audience's bodies. As his confidence grew, David's playing became more adventurous. He started experimenting with techniques he had only imagined before, complex runs up and down the keyboard, intricate patterns between his left and right hands, dynamics that ranged from whisper-soft to powerfully dramatic. The music told a story without words, taking listeners on an emotional journey they hadn't expected to experience at a school festival. In the audience, people were having profound personal reactions to David's music. Some listeners found themselves remembering childhood moments or feeling emotions they couldn't quite name. Others were simply mesmerized by the technical skill and artistic maturity they were witnessing from someone so young. The usual restlessness of a large crowd had completely disappeared. Mr. Rodriguez, David's English teacher, sat with tears in his eyes as he recognized the same depth of feeling in the music that he had occasionally glimpsed in David's written work. The quiet, thoughtful student who wrote such insightful essays was revealing the source of that sensitivity through his incredible musical expression. David's performance had now lasted much longer than the 5 minutes originally planned. But no one was checking their watches or growing impatient. The music had created a spell that held everyone in the auditorium captive. Even the youngest children in the audience sat perfectly still, somehow understanding that they were experiencing something special. The piano seemed to sing under David's touch as he wove together musical influences from every corner of his experience. Classical melodies merged with jazz harmonies, which then transformed into original compositions that captured universal emotions of hope, sadness, joy, and longing. The music spoke to something deep inside each listener, regardless of their age or musical background. Backstage, the remaining performers had abandoned their own pre-performance preparations to listen to David's extraordinary display. Mrs. Patterson found herself wondering how she could have been so wrong about what to expect from this quiet student. She had thought she was getting a simple piano recital to fill a slot in the program. Instead, she was witnessing the emergence of a truly gifted artist. David's grandmother would have been proud to see how completely he had embraced her advice to trust the music and let it flow naturally. All the technical skills he had developed in her basement were now serving the deeper purpose of authentic artistic expression. The music wasn't just notes being played correctly. It was David's soul speaking directly to the souls of everyone. Listening. As the performance continued, David began incorporating elements that seemed impossible for someone his age to understand so deeply. The music reflected not just teenage emotions, but universal human experiences of growth, loss, discovery, and transformation. Somehow, through pure instinct and natural talent, he was accessing artistic truths that usually took years of formal training and life experience to develop. The audience was witnessing something that rarely happens, the moment when natural talent, authentic emotion, and perfect circumstances combine to create pure magic. Many people would later describe David's performance as one of the most moving musical experiences of their lives, comparing it to concerts by famous artists they had paid significant money to see. David himself was only beginning to understand what was happening. Lost in the flow of the music, he had forgotten about his fear, his anxiety, and even the presence of the audience. He was simply being himself completely for the first time in his life, expressing through music all the thoughts and feelings he had never been able to share any other way. The transformation was remarkable not just for the audience, but for David himself. With each passing moment, he was discovering capabilities he never knew he possessed and accessing levels of artistic expression that surprised even him. The shy, invisible student was disappearing, replaced by a confident artist who was fearlessly sharing his deepest self with the world. As his improvised composition continued to unfold, David realized that this performance was changing him fundamentally. He would never again be able to hide completely behind his old patterns of invisibility. The music had revealed who he really was, and there would be no going back to his former life of carefully maintained anonymity. The spell his music had cast over the auditorium was about to reach its powerful climax. But neither David nor his audience was prepared for just how profound and life-changing this moment would prove to be. For nearly 15 minutes, David had been completely lost in his music, unaware of time passing or the profound effect he was having on everyone in the auditorium. The melody had taken him on a journey through every emotion he had ever felt, from the deepest loneliness to moments of pure joy. As the improvised composition began to reach its natural conclusion, David felt a sense of completion he had never experienced before. The final notes emerged from the piano with gentle, crystalline clarity. David's hands gradually slowed their movement across the keys, bringing the musical story to a soft, satisfying close. The last chord hung in the air for a moment, reverberating through the silent auditorium like a prayer that had found its answer. For several seconds after the music stopped, the silence was absolute. David sat at the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys, slowly returning to awareness of where he was and what had just happened. The spell that had carried him through the performance was beginning to break, and reality was creeping back in. Then it began. The applause started with David's father, who rose from his seat in the fourth row with tears streaming down his face. He had never heard anything so beautiful in his life, and the fact that it had come from his own son made the moment even more overwhelming. His clapping was joined immediately by David's mother, who was openly weeping as she stood and applauded. Within seconds, the standing ovation spread like wildfire throughout the auditorium. Row after row of people rose to their feet, their applause growing louder and more enthusiastic with each passing moment. Students who had never spoken to David were cheering and whistling. Teachers who had seen him as just another quiet student were applauding with genuine amazement and respect. David turned around on the piano bench to face the audience for the first time since he had begun playing. The sight that greeted him was beyond anything he could have imagined. Hundreds of people were on their feet, clapping enthusiastically and looking at him with expressions of awe and appreciation. The transformation from his usual invisibility to this moment of recognition was so dramatic it felt surreal. Mrs. Patterson stood in the wings, with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears running down her cheeks. She had organized dozens of school events over the years, but she had never witnessed anything like David's performance. The casual request she had made to a quiet student had somehow unlocked one of the most extraordinary musical experiences she had ever encountered. The applause continued to build rather than fade. People weren't just being polite or offering the standard appreciation expected at school events. This was genuine, enthusiastic recognition of something truly special. Several audience members were wiping their eyes, still processing the emotional journey David's music had taken them on. Encore! Encore! Someone shouted from the back of the auditorium, and the cry was quickly taken up by others throughout the crowd. David had never heard that word directed at him before, and it took him a moment to understand what people were asking for. They wanted him to play more music. Jennifer, who had performed her dance routine earlier in the evening, stood backstage watching the crowd's reaction with amazement. "I can't believe that's the same quiet kid from our English class," she whispered to another student. "Did you have any idea he could play like that?" The comedy duo, who had been so proud of their successful performance just an hour earlier, now felt like they had been completely overshadowed. But instead of resentment, they felt genuine admiration for what David had accomplished. "That was incredible," one of them said. "He didn't even use sheet music. Where did all that come from?" In the audience, David's classmates were having their own moments of revelation. Students who had eaten lunch at tables near his solitary corner were realizing they had completely misjudged the quiet boy they had barely noticed. The depth of emotion and technical skill they had just witnessed suggested a rich inner life that none of them had suspected. Mr. Rodriguez, David's English teacher, was applauding with particular enthusiasm. The sensitivity and emotional intelligence that occasionally appeared in David's essays suddenly made perfect sense. The music had revealed the source of the thoughtful perspective that Mr. Rodriguez had glimpsed in David's writing but had never fully understood. The mayor, who attended the Spring Festival every year as a community tradition, found himself genuinely moved by David's performance. He had expected the usual collection of amateur student acts, pleasant but forgettable. Instead, he had witnessed something that belonged in a professional concert hall. He made a mental note to mention this remarkable young musician in his upcoming community newsletter. Several school board members were equally impressed. They had been discussing budget cuts to arts programs just the week before, but David's performance was a powerful reminder of the hidden talents that might exist among their students. One board member leaned over to another and whispered, "We need to make sure this boy gets proper music training." The standing ovation had now lasted for nearly 3 minutes, with no sign of diminishing. David remained seated at the piano, overwhelmed by the response and unsure of what he was supposed to do. He had never received applause like this before, and had no experience with acknowledging an audience's appreciation. Mrs. Patterson finally appeared on stage, wiping her eyes and beaming with pride and amazement. She placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder and whispered, "Take a bow. They're applauding for you." David stood up slowly, his legs still shaky from the intensity of the performance and the shock of the audience's response. He managed an awkward bow, which only intensified the applause and cheering. Several people called out, "Bravo!" and "Amazing!" from various parts of the auditorium. The calls for an encore continued to echo through the crowd. David looked uncertainly at Mrs. Patterson, who nodded encouragingly. "If you feel up to it," she said quietly, "I think they would love to hear more." David sat back down at the piano, his hands finding the keys almost automatically. This time, he played something shorter and simpler, a gentle melody that seemed to thank the audience for their incredible response. Even this brief additional piece was met with enthusiastic appreciation. When David finally stood to take his final bow, the applause seemed to reach new heights. He walked off the stage in a daze, barely able to process what had just happened to his life. In the span of 15 minutes, he had gone from being the invisible kid in the back of the classroom to someone who had moved an entire community with his music. Backstage, David was immediately surrounded by other performers and crew members offering congratulations. "That was absolutely incredible. Where did you learn to play like that? Have you been taking lessons for years?" The questions came from all directions, and David found himself struggling to explain that he had taught himself everything on his grandmother's old piano. Mrs. Patterson appeared through the crowd of well-wishers, still emotional from what she had witnessed. "David," she said, taking his hands in hers, "that was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard. You have an extraordinary gift, As the evening continued with the remaining acts, David found it impossible to focus on anything except what had just happened. He had spent 3 years of high school carefully maintaining his invisibility, and in one evening that anonymity had been completely shattered. Everyone in the auditorium now knew exactly who David Chun was, but for the first time in his life, David didn't want to hide. The music had shown him who he really was, and the audience's response had shown him that his authentic self was something worth sharing with the world. The transformation was complete and irreversible, and David was beginning to realize that his life would never be the same again. The Monday morning after the Spring Festival felt like stepping into a completely different world for David. As he walked through the hallways of Riverside High, something fundamental had changed. Students who had never acknowledged his existence before were stopping him to talk about his performance. Teachers were greeting him by name with genuine warmth and respect. The invisible boy who had navigated these same corridors unnoticed for 3 years was suddenly the center of attention. "David, that was incredible on Friday night," called out Jennifer from across the hallway. She jogged over to catch up with him, her face bright with enthusiasm. "I had no idea you could play like that. How long have you been practicing piano?" David found himself in conversations he had never imagined having. Students wanted to know about his musical background, where he had learned to play, and whether he planned to perform again. The questions were overwhelming but not unpleasant. For the first time in his high school career, people were genuinely interested in getting to know him. By Tuesday, word of David's performance had spread beyond the school community. Mrs. Chun, his grandmother, called him excitedly to tell him that neighbors had been stopping by her house to ask about her talented grandson. "Mrs. Liu from next door heard about your performance from her daughter," she said with pride in her voice. "She wants to know if you give piano lessons." The idea of teaching piano had never occurred to David, but as his grandmother mentioned it, he realized it might be something he would enjoy. The thought of sharing his love of music with others, especially younger students, felt natural and appealing. Wednesday brought an unexpected visit to the guidance counselor's office. Mrs. Thompson, whom David had met only briefly during course selection, had requested to see him during his lunch period. "David, I've been hearing remarkable things about your performance at the festival," she said warmly. "I wanted to discuss some opportunities that might interest you." She spread several brochures and application forms across her desk. "These are summer music programs at universities across the state. Many of them offer scholarships for talented students like yourself. I think you should consider applying." David stared at the glossy brochures featuring smiling students with instruments, concert halls, and descriptions of intensive musical training. The idea of spending a summer focused entirely on music felt like a dream he had never dared to imagine. "There's also this," Mrs. Thompson continued, pulling out another form. "The state music competition is accepting applications for next year. Students who place well often receive scholarship offers from music schools." The conversation opened doors David hadn't known existed. Mrs. Thompson explained how his performance had demonstrated not just talent, but the kind of artistic maturity that music schools actively sought in their applicants. She encouraged him to start thinking seriously about his musical future. That afternoon at his grandmother's house, David shared the news about the summer programs and competitions. His grandmother listened with tears of joy in her eyes, remembering how she had first encouraged him to explore the old piano in her basement. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said softly. "He always believed that music was meant to be shared with the world. You've honored his memory in the most beautiful way." David's parents, still processing the revelation of their son's hidden talent, were incredibly supportive when he showed them the scholarship applications. They arranged for him to start taking formal piano lessons with a respected teacher in the city, someone who could help him develop his technical skills to match his natural artistry. The first lesson with Professor Williams was both exciting and intimidating. The elderly pianist had performed with symphony orchestras around the world and had taught at prestigious music schools. When David played for him, Professor Williams listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the depth of what he was hearing. "You have something very rare," Professor Williams said after David finished playing. "Technical skills can be taught, but the musical soul you possess is a gift that can't be learned. My job will be to help you develop the tools to express that gift even more effectively." By the end of his first month of formal lessons, David was amazed at how much his playing had improved. Professor Williams introduced him to advanced techniques and musical concepts that enhanced his natural abilities without diminishing his authentic voice. The combination of formal training with his intuitive musicality created something even more powerful than what he had demonstrated at the festival. The summer music program acceptance letter arrived in May, along with a full scholarship that covered tuition, room, and board. David would spend 6 weeks at the State University, studying with accomplished musicians and performing alongside other talented young artists from across the region. That summer transformed David's understanding of what was possible in his life. Surrounded by other serious young musicians, he discovered a community where his passion for music was not only understood but celebrated. He made friends who shared his dedication to artistic expression, something he had never experienced before. The program concluded with a showcase concert, where David performed one of his original compositions for an audience that included talent scouts from several universities. The response was overwhelming, and by the end of the evening, David had received preliminary scholarship offers from 3 different music schools. Senior year brought a completely different high school experience. David's confidence, built through musical success and genuine friendships, extended into other areas of his life. He joined the school's newly formed music club, helped organize additional concerts, and even ran for student government, winning a position as arts representative. The shy boy who had eaten lunch alone was now surrounded by friends who appreciated his thoughtful nature and artistic sensibilities. David discovered that the same qualities that had made him a remarkable musician, sensitivity, introspection, and emotional depth, also made him a valued friend and leader. College applications became an exciting process rather than a source of anxiety. David applied to several prestigious music schools, each application strengthened by recordings of his performances and letters of recommendation from teachers who had witnessed his remarkable growth. The acceptance letters began arriving. In March of his senior year, not only was David accepted to his top-choice music school, but he was offered a full scholarship that would cover his entire education. The same institution that had seemed impossibly out of reach just 2 years earlier was now eager to have him as a student. At graduation, David was selected to perform a piece during the ceremony. As he sat at the piano in front of his entire graduating class and their families, he thought back to that terrifying night at the Spring Festival. The fear that had once paralyzed him had been transformed into excitement and purpose. Years later, as a successful concert pianist performing in venues around the world, David would often reflect on that pivotal evening at Riverside High. What had begun as Mrs. Patterson's desperate search for festival performers had unlocked a destiny he never could have imagined. His grandmother's old upright piano still held a place of honor in his apartment, a reminder of where his musical journey had begun. Before every major performance, David would sit at those familiar keys and remember the quiet boy who had once hidden his gift in a basement, too afraid to let the world hear his music. The transformation from invisible student to celebrated artist had taught David that our greatest fears often guard our most precious gifts. That terrifying 5-minute performance slot had become the foundation for a life filled with music, friendship, and the deep satisfaction that comes from sharing your authentic self with the world. Mrs. Patterson, now retired from teaching, still kept a recording of David's festival performance on her phone. She would play it for friends and colleagues as an example of why she had always believed that every student had hidden potential waiting to be discovered. Sometimes she would say with a smile, "All it takes is the right moment and the courage to say yes to possibility." David's story became legendary at Riverside High, inspiring other quiet students to take risks and share their own hidden talents. The Spring Festival continued to be an annual tradition, but teachers and students alike remembered it as the night when they learned that extraordinary gifts can be found in the most unexpected places.